All right, so sorry about that. I was just checking to make sure the camera was on and recording. Now we're not very far away from the first video, the northern hardwood video. Hopefully you've watched that one. We're maybe 100 or 200 meters away, but we're on the top of the ridge and moving over to a west-southwest exposure. And so on the very top of the ridge, you might expect the soils are going to be even a little bit thinner, and they likely are. You can see rocks protruding even on the level ground here. It's likely a little bit drier up here, and so we have a slightly different suite of species now that we've got to the top of the ridge and we're on a slightly different soil profile and a slightly different moisture and sunlight regime, right? So factors that affect natural communities: soils, moisture, topography, aspect, which is the direction that the slope faces, right? You can hear blue jay making that rattling noise. You can hear a crow in the distance right there. You can hear clementine coming up behind me. But this is a different natural community type. This is mostly a hemlock forest. So eastern hemlock are the dominant trees in this forest. So most of the trees around here are hemlock. And one of the things we might also assume, if we know a little bit about the ecology of eastern hemlock, is that this is probably a slightly more acidic site than the northern hardwood forest where we just were. Those trees, those species, sugar maple in particular, yellow birch, they like slightly more or less acidic soils. Right, so they're going to prefer to grow on soils with a little bit higher pH than things like hemlocks, which are more have more affinity for acidic soils. And over time, they increase the acidity of the soil through the decomposition of their needles. The needles are a little bit more acidic than the hardwood leaves, and they will add to that effect of acidity. Hemlock is very shade tolerant, and you can see it's pretty shady up here. It's, I don't know, about probably closing in on 10 o'clock in the morning. And so while the sun is fairly high in the sky, the hemlock provides a pretty dense canopy all year long, right? It's not going to lose those needles in the next month. So hemlock sites tend to be fairly shady, and you'll notice there's very little regeneration or very little young trees growing in the understory here. Partly that's a shade effect, partly it's a soil acidity effect that only some tree species are going to want to grow in those acidic soils. And so it's a blend. So we're seeing some species that we would see on the other sites. So in front of me is a red maple. Red maples are fairly ubiquitous throughout our eastern forest. They grow in a lot of different forest types, a lot of different soil conditions, both dry and wet. They grow on ridge tops like this. They grow in river systems, in floodplains, and every site in between. So while some species are an indicator of certain site attributes, like hemlock would be an indicator of an acidic soil, more likely, red maples really don't indicate anything about the type because they grow in so many different environmental conditions. So white birch, again, white birch is an intolerant, shade intolerant species, and gives us an idea of the age of this stand, that this white birch wouldn't have sprouted underneath a hemlock canopy. So it probably seeded in slightly before the hemlocks began to dominate the site. So a relatively young patch of forest that we're in right now. Younger perhaps than the northern hardwood forest. Not by much, but a little bit. We're moving over to more of the west facing slope now. It's going to be a little bit drier. We're going up. You can see right on this rocky ridge. This is basically the bedrock right here. Granite bedrock. Granite tends to be more acidic than some of the other parent materials or other bedrocks that we might find in southern New England. So again, that's cluing us into some of these site conditions. As we go over here, you'll notice a lot of acorns on the ground, acorn caps. Right? These are fresh acorn caps, so they're still kind of bright, and I can tell they're a little bit green. So these are acorns that were just produced this year and just dropped. And we'll look around, and again, on this drier western exposure, I'm finding northern red oaks. So this is a northern red oak, right? Or oak leaves on the ground with the pointed lobes. So northern red oaks are the species that have the pointed lobes. I think in one of the early videos about the difference between red and white oaks, I mentioned the red oaks have these long, if I didn't, you'll get it now. Red oaks have these long, vertical, flat surfaces going up and down the stem. So white oaks get that kind of flaky bark that turns a little bit gray and breaks off into small little plates when they're mature. Red oaks have this function where their bark is darker and then it's broken up with these long flat ridges. They almost look like ski slopes running up and down the trunk of the tree. And so in here there are a number of northern red oaks, and they're producing acorns. Some of them are quite large, so this one in front of us will go down there. Hopefully I won't fall off of this slippery rock. I'm walking through these young hemlocks. You can see, hopefully you can see some of this pattern on the bark, and that's a history of deer eating the hemlock bark in the wintertime. So in some years, maybe when we've had some deeper snow, one of the winter foods for deer will be the bark of these hemlocks. They'll come up here and strip some of this bark off, and then you can see it. You can kind of get a sense of how the hemlock bark should look, kind of normal, platy bark like that. And then here there are these areas where it's smooth, which is an indication that the bark had been peeled off in the past by deer in the wintertime. Clementines are already down there and back, but here's a big red oak. I'm sorry I don't have a measuring stick with me to give you a better sense of the scale. But you know, this one, I'm holding my hand up. This one, if the span of my hand is well over 7 inches, you know, this tree is over 20 inches in diameter, probably close to 2 feet in diameter. And I'm looking around at the base, and there are chewed acorns. There's some disturbance in the leaves.